Hello and welcome to Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin, and today we're going to be talking about permitted development rights in the property industry. And with me today I have Ranjan Bhattacharya, recognised expert in the field. Welcome, Ranjan.
Thank you for having me, Stephen.
Good. Well, look, here we go. In 2013 through to 2015, the government introduced these new permitted development rights. I think the first thing I'm going to do is, can you explain what they are and what they're for?
Well, why they have come about? I mean, I think we all know, and we have known for a long, long time, that the planning system in the UK is not really fit for purpose. It takes too long to get things done. Of course, you know, if you're a householder and you've got a simple extension or something like that, it's not too much of a big deal. The problem is when you want to create new dwellings, whether converting existing buildings or creating new dwellings in fields or space by building new houses. That's when it can take a long, long time. And this is evident in the statistics because, you know, 30 years ago, more than 40% of all new dwellings were created by small-time developers. Today, that figure's come down to 12%. And the financing is plentiful. It's not the fact that developers can't get money. What you can't do is commit to a project where you haven't got a clue whether you're going to get permission to build. You can't get the financing for uncertainty. So if you're a big developer, you can fund these pipeline and land bank things and all the rest of it. But for the small, medium-sized developers, they need certainty that if they're going to commit to a project, because they're going to be backed by financing, that they can actually build what they want to build.
Okay. Now, just while we're on the subject of big developers, is there any value in the argument that big developers do tend to sit on their land banks and not develop?
Well,
or is that just the logistics of planning?
I think it's a little bit of a myth. You know, I don't see any reason why a big developer would want a land bank. What happens is it's phasing. If you've got several sites and you've got your development teams, you know, you will want to cycle them through so that you have different crews at different stages of the projects. So you're scheduling the build out of multiple sites depending on the resources and the teams that you have. And I believe that's the majority of what's going on.
Okay. I mean, typically on a, let's say, a housing estate or a block of flats where there are perhaps 50, 60 or 100 units, what sort of time is involved in getting planning these days?
Oh, how long is a piece of string? I mean, you can be lucky enough to have it in a few months, or it can take several years. As a rough rule of thumb, in more deprived areas, the councils are desperate to see investment. So they're much more encouraging of developers to invest in the area. In higher value areas where developers are attracted because that's where the returns are, that's where the end customer is for the end unit, councils take a different view.
Okay. And what about the historic add-ons that we've always had to planning, you know, the 106 agreements, the social housing requirements? How is that adjusting these days?
Well, you know, it's all about, at the end of the day, it's dependent on the end values that you're going to get out of a development when you sell it or let it out. And then you've got to work your way backwards. So I start at the end. You work out your profit that you're looking to make, and then you look at all your costs. And that gets you back to how much the site is worth paying for. If the figures don't work, don't do it. Now, if you feel that the figures don't work with things like Section 106 taxes that the local authorities have piled on,
which is what they were,
then there is a process to go back to the council and present a viability statement to say, look, it's not viable with these taxes, and there is a mechanism for getting that reduced.
Okay, fine.
Well, that's under planning. With PD, you don't have to worry about all that.
Right, I was going to say, well, coming back to PD, the government then presumably are trying to speed up the process and solve the shortage of housing that we've got and allow conversions with a much more liberal attitude. And I presume that really what we're saying is that these permitted developments have the presumption of acceptance.
Yes, and I think the government have done this. I actually believe the government have done this thinking about I know people don't believe the government is capable of that much forethought and planning and forward planning, but I think they've joined a lot of dots together. We're not building enough houses, that's just a fact. And the other thing is this massive oversupply of offices and also retail premises across the country, because the way people do business has changed, and that has accelerated due to COVID. So what do you do with these empty and redundant commercial buildings? So they've changed the rules to allow commercial properties to be easily repurposed to alternative commercial uses and also to residential usage. Now that's very important as well, because it's not just about converting it to residential. Before, let's say we all know banks are shutting down left, right and centre because the way they're doing business has changed. So a lot of these bank buildings are rather nice and pretty. They've got stone frontages. They usually have prime pitches and a parade. But now they would be more suited to, say, a restaurant use. But until very recently, you'd have to apply for full planning permission to change the ground floor banking hall to a restaurant. Now you're good to go, because those sort of changes under permitted development are allowed. You don't have to ask anyone. So you can repurpose commercial buildings to other commercial uses far more easily, and also to residential use as well.
Okay, let's just talk about some of the residential changes that are now allowed. I understand there's sort of 3 or 4 categories that fall under this permitted right, which are?
Well, the main category, I think, well, first of all, they've squashed many previous usage classes of commercial properties into this new usage class E. And that encompasses things like newsagents, estate agents, banks, building societies, travel agents, gyms, GP surgeries, dentist surgeries, kids nurseries, restaurants, all sorts of these different building types have been, there used to be separate usages for these, and to change from one use to another required full planning. They've now become one usage class, commercial property usage class. And the government have brought in permitted development rights, which allow you to do things to any building in that new class, which is quite massive. So they come under, there's 2 categories really. One which is called Class MA. And I think the government have tried to be a bit confusing here, because they use the word class as a noun to describe usage classes. And they also use class as a verb to describe what you can do to commercial property. So when I talk about usage class E, that's commercial usage. And then when I talk about the PD rights, they are also called classes, but they describe what you can do to usages of commercial property.
I'm pretty sure I get it.
They shouldn't have done that. They should have come up with a different name for it, but that's what they've done. So one of the main new rights that they've brought in is what they call MA. And I think that stands for mercantile to abode, because that's what these civil service types, language that they speak, I guess. So mercantile to abode, which is basically commercial to residential. And that allows, under certain criteria, commercial properties to be repurposed to residential use. And that can be pretty much any commercial building in usage class E. So if you've got an office building, as long as it's not more than 15,000 square foot, which is pretty big, quite frankly, you can convert that building into flats under this rule.
Okay. Previously, you'd have to demonstrate that there was no viable business for that premises, wouldn't you, before you'd be allowed to convert?
Yes, and I think what the government have said is, because these rights are far-reaching and they allow a hell of a lot to be done that you couldn't do just a few months ago. So what they have said is, what they don't want is nasty developers, and I'm sure there are no nasty developers watching this, but nasty developers buying a commercial office, applying for permitted development to convert it into 20 flats, and then turfing out the commercial occupiers of that building, which used to happen. Now they can't do that, because it's for repurposing defunct commercial buildings. So the building needs to be vacant for 3 months before you can apply for the permitted development right to convert. So that kind of takes away that sting in the tail.
Okay. And do you think this is fundamentally changing our process?
Planning process, yes, because it allows you to self-assess whether or not you're going to get in or not.
Mm.
And the kind of property projects we're looking at right now, you can go in there, you know the rules, you've got Class MA, you've got Class G, you know what the rules are in terms of what they're looking, the boxes you need to tick, because there's no opinion of the planning officer that comes in to play here. It is strict tick box criteria. So what I do is I assess the site based on the knowledge I have about what these criteria are. I'll get a planning consultant to validate it, just to make sure I haven't missed anything out, because sometimes we do. And then you're good to go.
Okay.
And you know you're going to get it in 56 days.
Okay. Now, look, so one identifies the building, you've got it vacant, you've got that 3-month window there, that's been satisfied. You still have to go to your council and put this proposition forward. And as I say, there is a presumption of acceptance. But as I think we've mentioned in one of our previous programmes on Property Question Time, we've had questions in where people are saying some of the local authorities are not actually playing ball with this. They're not accepting this permitted development right.
They don't like it. I mean, of course, it's taken away a huge amount of power and influence that they have. But there is a limited amount they can do with it. The legislation is the legislation, and they can't break the law. What they are doing is some councils are going and applying for Article 4s, which is a way that they can get an exemption from some of these rules applying.
Okay. Now,
the criteria that the government have set now for a local authority to demonstrate there's a valid reason why they should be exempt from the permitted development rules is very, very tight.
Okay.
So the burden of proof that the local authority has to demonstrate to show that they warrant an exception, they warrant to be excluded from these national rights, is much higher than it was a year ago. It remains to be seen whether they will get their way.
Okay. Well, on that note, we're going to go to a commercial break. Join me again after that break and we'll have some more of Ranjan's thoughts on permitted development rights.
We'll get back to the video in just a moment, but what I wanted to really tell you about was what is the most exciting opportunity in property right now, and that is repurposing defunct commercial buildings to residential use. Now, most people don't really know where to start, what to look for, and how to exploit these opportunities, and that's why I've prepared 90 minutes of free training for you to get you started on this wonderful journey. You can register for this free training at property-workshop.com. Join me on that free training, and I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of the video.
Hello, I'm Stephen Galpin and welcome back to Part 2 of Property Matters. I'm joined by Ranjan Bhattacharya, who's an expert on permitted development rights in terms of planning and commercial properties. Ranjan, we've talked in the first part of the show about why the government brought this in, how it's working, how it's had to be looked at again, I think, to make the categories and opportunities for councils to resist this innovation. Let's talk now a little bit about the high streets, where we're seeing in the press every day difficulties with high streets, shops closing down because of COVID. And there does seem to be a lot of opportunity there to make our smaller high streets work with perhaps change of use, change of categories. And I do know that you've just recently embarked on a project that has seen the change of a banking hall effectively into something quite useful. Perhaps you'd like to?
Yes, I mean, we've just undertaken a project in Leicester, which is a former bank building. And the interesting thing about this is it really kind of underlines a lot of the things that we've been talking about. So one of the things that is very challenging is the demand for massive retail space. Those were designed for just old world business models. So with this particular building, it's in an area of town where ground floor conversion wouldn't be appropriate, because ultimately as a developer, you're looking to maximize the end value of every square foot of space in that building. And the strategy for square footage of space is different depending on where it is in the building. So for the upper floors, those were formerly offices for the bank. It makes sense to convert them to residential use. but because of the footfall and passing traffic in the area, it doesn't make sense to make the ground floor into residential use. It's better to keep it as commercial. But there's no demand for such a massive, it's something like 2,700 square foot on the ground floor. It's a big shop. But because it's very wide, 12-meter wide frontage, and it's very strange, it fronts onto 2 different streets. So what we're going to do is actually split that up into 4 smaller shops.
Okay.
And that meets the retail demand at the moment, which is far more for service sector businesses. They don't need that much space in the shop. What they need is good frontage, good footfall for those sort of businesses to operate.
Okay, and would this have been possible under the earlier regime of planning rules?
Well, that bit, no. Because interestingly enough, when you take a residential property and you want to subdivide it into smaller units, that's flat conversion, you need full planning permission. You've never needed planning permission to convert a larger retail space into a bunch of smaller units, provided you don't alter the outside.
Okay.
So yes, we can chop this shop into 4 relatively straightforward. What we're allowed to do, though, is subject to criteria, convert the space above into 10 one-bedroom apartments.
And this is without specific consent? Or?
We have to go through the prior approval process, which basically means the plans, you need to submit your plans to the council. You have to demonstrate that you fulfill all the checklist criteria for Class MA conversion of commercial space to residential use. And then in 56 days, you get your permission.
Okay. I mean, I think things are changing, but like a lot of things in life, nothing ever's new, is it, really? I mean, I'm thinking in London here, we had the Whiteley's store in Bayswater. That was a huge store at one time. I think it was owned by Selfridges, if I'm not wrong. That was then converted into many, many smaller shops and became actually very successful after being a little bit of a white elephant, I suppose. So that's happened before, but the difference this time is that you can bring residential into the equation. That's the real key, isn't it?
Yes, because I think the way the office market has gone has negated the need for a lot of these offices above retail premises. They're not that attractive place to work out of. So those are being converted. There's also a massive issue with shops being wrong sized up and down the country. And what I mean by that is you've got these shops which have a relatively narrow frontage, but it's massively deep because it's been extended in the past so that they could ram in as much product as possible on shelves. Now that's gone to Amazon. And the service sector retailers don't need those long, deep shops. They just need the space at the front. So permitted development allows you, as long as assuming you've got natural light, is to convert that low value rear space of the shop into a flat, which gives you an extra dwelling, but also is a phenomenal uplift in value of the site.
Where you have these high street malls, concentrated shopping areas, in the past, these have tended to be owned by the institutional landlords looking for blue chip tenants all the time, looking for the longest leases and the highest rents they can get. Is that market changing?
I think that market is changing dramatically. I mean, different types of property owners are looking for different things. And this is the thing with the commercial property space. So I'm not really going to talk about what the large funds and pensions are looking at, because they're looking at a very different investment criteria to people like myself in the private sector looking to build commercial portfolios. Now, most of the commercial property in the UK is actually owned by these funds and is actually owned unencumbered. People like me represent a relatively small sector of the market, but we tend to represent the individual shops and uppers, if you like, on secondary parades and high streets that are dotted around, rather than the big shopping centre type sectors. So with those smaller landlords, they're really looking at a different type of tenant base, because I think the COVID crisis has demonstrated that blue chip isn't what it's all cracked up to be.
No.
I probably can't say it on telly, but there's been a lot of very high profile big names who weren't in the can't pay, won't pay category during COVID. They were in the can pay, won't pay category.
Yes.
And the reason they got away with it is because they have great lawyers and great legal teams and all of that to really roughshod over all the rules and regulations and the smaller landlords. And what's happening now is that people like us, we are favouring smaller operators, small chains, independent kind of stores and things. I feel we get a better covenant because all the tenancies that we do, we insist on the proprietor acting as a personal guarantor on the lease. And those sort of business owners tend to be homeowners, so you have an amazing, secure tenant. And that is far better than some large company setting up a separate limited company owned by some Bermuda offshore thingy.
Yes.
And they just fold overnight and you've got no one on the hook.
Yes, yes. I mean, I presume this is going to apply. I mean, if we take London's Oxford Street, there's a lot of empty property there at the moment, and that's because of some of the change of direction of some of the big stores, as you identified. And I just wonder sometimes how those institutional landlords will actually cope in the future, whether they'll go off into other sort of areas, perhaps rather more office-based, perhaps rather than retail-based. I don't know.
I think the, as we discussed previously, I think the Oxford Street market is a completely different dynamic to much of the rest of the country, mainly because the footfall there is massively dependent on tourism, and tourism is hammered because of COVID. And when we see the COVID restrictions kind of lift and people are coming back in more numbers, you'll see a quick bounce back. We've already seen a massive bounce back in the prime London residential property market. The commercial, I think, has lagged behind, particularly retail commercial, simply because the tourists are not coming in with all the checks and things that they have to cover. But that market, I think, is completely different to the rest of the country. Okay. I think the thing is, what people like me are doing is creating more of a market for smaller shops in the rest of the country. Because if you think about it, a lot of the space above commercial premises, shops and the like, were not used and defunct, quite frankly. They were ancillary storage spaces.
Very expensive storage areas, yes.
Well, you don't need those storage stuff if it's all in an Amazon warehouse or wherever. So and the people that want to live in these well-located places tend to be young folks, single people, couples and that kind of stuff. So we're building one-bedroom apartments in these commercial buildings. And by having residential occupation again in those areas, that creates a need for services. Because people don't want to hop in their car for everything. They want to be 2 minutes away where they can get a cup of coffee or get a drink or get some food to eat, some local convenience stores as opposed to driving down to a big supermarket. So that is breathing more life into some of these secondary parades simply because there are more people living there now.
Okay. Just for the final few minutes, I'd just like to talk about commercial premises in terms of office space. I mean, I can think, I'm just wondering how many years ago, well, it was probably 25 years ago now, I was involved with the development on Marylebone Road there, which was an office block, which was converted. At the time, there was a huge resistance to people buying in there. They said, well, it's an office block. Why do I want to be here? There's no shops immediately around, no facilities, one thing or another. But actually, in time, it's worked very well, and it's a very popular building now. But how much do you think this trend of coming out of office, working from home because of COVID will actually last? Do you think these office blocks will take up full occupation again, or do you think it is a permanent trend that we're seeing?
Well, the requirement for office space has dwindled, but that's not going to go away. Everyone will need a base. We run a serviced office building in St Albans, and one of the things we find is that a company will come along and they'll take a 6-person suite. But you look on their website and you see the About Us and About Our People page, and they've got about 20 faces there.
Right.
They're not all crammed into a 6-person suite. It's not. They need a base. They need a place where a core of people can come into, because people are not coming into the office every day. And when they do come, there are meeting rooms and all of that they can use on the premises for when they want to get together. But the requirement for a base, for a core of people, is not going to go away.
I think you're right. Ranjan Bhattacharya, thank you very much for coming in today. That's all we've got time for on Property Matters on this show, so join me again next time. I'm Stephen Galpin. Take care. See you soon.